It was the summer of 2009, and I was driving from Huntington Beach, California, to Carson City, Nevada. A friend of mine had invited me to spend a few days with him, and I figured the trip would be a good chance to clear my head. It was supposed to be a simple 9 to 10 hour drive, but as I sit here recounting this, I can say with certainty that it was anything but simple. The first few hours of the trip were uneventful. I left just after sunset, wanting to avoid the worst of the Los Angeles traffic. By the time I hit the open highways near Victorville, the city lights were behind me, and the only company I had was the hum of my car engine and the occasional trucker on the road. I always found these drives oddly peaceful, though there was something about the barren stretches of highway that felt unsettling if you thought about them too much. Around midnight, I passed through the small town of Lone Pine, heading toward the eastern Sierra Nevadas. The towering mountains on one side and the vast desert on the other created a sense of isolation that was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. I had music playing low on the radio and a thermos of coffee beside me to keep me awake. Somewhere near Bridgeport, a remote mountain town about 3 hours from my destination, things started to get strange. It was well past 2 a.m., and the road had become winding and narrow, with steep drops on one side. The darkness was oppressive, with only my headlights cutting through it. That's when I noticed a bright light behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe a truck or an off-road vehicle. But the light was unusually bright, almost blinding. It didn't make sense for someone to be using high beams on such a curvy road, especially when there was no way to pass me. I glanced at my rearview mirror and squinted, trying to make out the vehicle. It wasn't a car, though. It didn't have the distinct 2 points of light you'd expect from headlights. It was just a single, intense glow. The light drew closer, so bright that it illuminated the inside of my car. My dashboard and hands on the steering wheel were glowing, as if someone had pointed a massive spotlight directly at me. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. I told myself it was just a prankster, or maybe even a highway patrol car with an overpowered spotlight, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried focusing on the road ahead, but the light kept getting brighter and closer. It was so intense that I couldn't look in my rear view or side mirrors anymore without being blinded. My palms started to sweat, and I gripped the wheel tighter, unsure of what to do. Should I pull over? Speed up? My heart was racing, and my instincts were screaming at me to get away. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. I slammed on my brakes, pulling off to the side of the road. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing. The darkness was back, thick and heavy, and there was no sign of the light or any vehicle behind me. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking on the wheel, before convincing myself to keep driving. I had no explanation for what had just happened, but I didn't want to sit there alone in the middle of nowhere. The next thing I remember, it was daylight. I was sitting in my car, which was idling in a parking lot I didn't recognize. I looked around, disoriented. It was a municipal lot with a few trucks parked nearby and a vending machine off to one side. My car was the only civilian vehicle there. The dashboard clock said it was 9:45 a.m., but the last time I had checked, it was just after 2 a.m. Where had the last 7 hours gone? I felt a strange heaviness in my body, like I'd just woken up from a deep sleep, but I couldn't remember pulling over to rest. My coffee thermos was empty, though I didn't remember drinking it all. The gas gauge was lower than it should have been, as if I'd been driving for hours, but I had no memory of the roads or scenery. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling me. It was my friend, asking where I was. I told him I was on my way and should be there in a few hours. There was a long pause before he responded. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been 3 days since I last heard from you." I stared at the screen, feeling a chill creep down my spine. "That's not possible," I replied. "I've been driving the whole time. Maybe I stopped to nap, but it hasn't been 3 days." "You've been partying, haven't you?" he said, his tone accusatory. "If you're messing around in some hotel, just tell me." "I'm not," I insisted. "I'm coming right now." The rest of the drive to Carson City was surreal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. When I arrived, my friend looked genuinely shocked to see me. He kept asking what I'd been doing for the past 3 days, but I had no answers. I checked my phone's call log and GPS history, but there were no records of activity during that time. It was as if I'd simply ceased to exist for 3 days. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened. A friend of mine, who's a member of Mensa and a former Air Force officer, once listened to my story and told me it sounded like a classic abduction scenario. He mentioned the bright light, the missing time, and the sudden reappearance in an unfamiliar place as common elements in such cases. I laughed it off at the time, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the possibility. I've never told anyone else about that night. It still haunts me, not just because of what might have happened, but because I'll probably never know the truth. Every now and then, I'll catch myself staring at the sky, wondering if whatever I saw out there is still watching. One thing I'm certain of, we are not alone. It was late October of 2017. I remember the year clearly because that fall had been unusually warm, with a few days still reaching the mid-70s. By the time night fell, though, the temperatures would drop quickly, leaving the air damp and cold. I was driving down a narrow, rural road just outside of Waverly, Tennessee. It was one of those roads primarily used by farmers, paved but barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Deep ditches lined either side, and beyond them were thick woods that often flooded into swampy pockets after heavy rains. It was the kind of road you didn't want to find yourself on unless you knew it well, and I did. Or at least, I thought I did. That night, I was coming back from a late shift at the manufacturing plant where I worked. My coworker had called out sick, so I stayed longer than usual, pushing my drive home to just after 1 a.m. I didn't mind the late hour. I'd done the drive dozens of times before and was used to the eerie quiet of these back roads. There was rarely any traffic that late, and I could usually zone out with the low hum of my car's engine as my only companion. The night was unusually still, with the kind of silence that feels heavy. My high beams were on, cutting through the darkness and reflecting off the occasional patches of fog that hugged the road. The fall weather meant deer were more active, and I was scanning the ditches for any sudden movement. Hitting a deer out here wasn't just dangerous. It was a guaranteed way to wreck your car and leave you stranded miles from the nearest help. The first mile of the road was uneventful, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But as I passed through a particularly low stretch of road where the woods pressed closer, I drove into a pocket of dense ground fog. It wasn't unusual for fog to pool in that area. It was near a shallow creek, but it was thick enough that I instinctively slowed down, keeping my hands tight on the wheel. The fog clung to my car for a few seconds, blurring the edges of my headlights, and then, just as suddenly as I had entered it, I was out. Visibility was crystal clear again, and my eyes immediately scanned the ditches out of habit. That's when I saw it. A figure was crawling out of the ditch on my right side. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone who had gotten lost or drunk and ended up in the ditch. But something about the way it moved made my stomach twist. It didn't crawl like a person would. It jerked forward in short, uneven bursts, like it was being yanked by invisible strings. Its movements were unnatural, almost mechanical, and yet there was no sound. No rustling leaves, no crunch of dirt or gravel. I slowed the car down instinctively, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure had no legs. From the waist down, there was nothing but empty space, and yet it was pulling itself forward with its arms, which looked unnaturally long and thin. It was pale, almost grayish, and as my headlights passed over it, I saw its head turn toward me. There were no facial features that I could make out, just a smooth, blank surface where a face should have been. I gasped and instinctively swerved slightly to the left, away from the ditch. My tires skidded on the loose gravel, and for a second, I thought I was going to slide into the opposite ditch. But I managed to straighten out, and when I looked back at the road, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my palms were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I didn't stop to look back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get as far away from that spot as possible. About half a mile up the road, I found a field entrance wide enough to turn my car around. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness behind me. Something about what I had seen felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it had been a deer caught in an awkward position, or maybe some branches had fallen into the ditch and created the illusion of movement. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but I couldn't explain what I had seen. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. I turned the car around and gunned it all the way home. My heart didn't stop racing until I was safely in my driveway, and even then, I couldn't shake the image of that figure jerking its way out of the ditch. I didn't sleep much that night. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told a few people at work, hoping they might have an explanation that made sense. Most of them laughed it off, saying I must have been overtired or imagining things. A couple joked about swamp gas or a trick of the headlights. I laughed along with them, but I knew what I had seen. I started avoiding that road entirely, even if it added an extra 10 minutes to my drive. I didn't want to be anywhere near that stretch of woods. A few weeks later, my boss asked me to help him with some field work. We needed to move equipment to one of his properties, and the quickest route took us down that same road. I hesitated but didn't want to seem paranoid, so I went along. As we drove past the spot where I'd seen the figure, my chest tightened, and I couldn't resist telling him about it. To my surprise, he didn't laugh or brush it off. Instead, he gave me a strange look and said, "You know, a farmer died out here years ago. Rolled his tractor into one of these ditches. They said he was crushed beneath it, and by the time anyone found him, there wasn't much left." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't known about the accident, and I didn't know the man or his family. But hearing that story made me wonder if there was some connection between his death and what I had seen. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe my tired brain conjured up something that wasn't really there. But when I think back to the way that figure moved, the unnatural jerking motion and the smooth blankness where its face should have been, I can't shake the feeling that it was something real. Something I wasn't supposed to see. I haven't driven down that road since, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplored. I was driving across the country from Washington State to Georgia in the summer of 2023. It was June 29th when we first hit the road, and I knew it was going to be a long journey. The plan was to make the drive in stages. Just me and my friend, with our trusty dog, Ellie, curled up in the back seat. The miles felt like they stretched on forever, especially with the seemingly endless stretches of highway passing beneath the wheels. The journey had been pretty uneventful until we passed through Laramie, Wyoming. By then, we'd already been driving for hours, the road just one long, monotonous stretch, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I'd been keeping the wheel steady, but after switching freeways and heading into a more isolated stretch of road, the fatigue hit hard. I told my friend to take over, and I nodded off. I can't remember exactly when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, we were passing through Colorado Springs, Colorado. The sun was lower in the sky now, and it was my turn to take over. My friend looked exhausted, like he'd been driving for far too long. As we swapped seats, he muttered something about needing sleep. "You okay?" I asked, just glancing at him as I settled in. His eyes were heavy, but I figured it was just from the long hours on the road. He gave me a half smile but didn't say much. Then he added something strange. "You won't believe what I saw, hundreds of headless dogs on the road. I've been seeing them for the last 40 miles. Their bodies just laying there, no heads anywhere." I blinked at him, unsure if he was joking or if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. "What? Dude, you need sleep. You're seeing things." He shook his head, his face pale, but he didn't argue. "I'm serious," he said quietly, his voice almost hollow. There were so many of them. I didn't think much of it. We were both tired, and I figured he just needed rest. But I was so wrong. As I started driving, the highway opened up before me, wide and empty, the kind of empty that felt eerie at night. The road was winding through vast stretches of open land, and at first, everything seemed normal. But then it hit me. I saw the first one, a small chihuahua, lifeless on the shoulder of the freeway. Its body lay there, still and unmoving, with no head. The absence of the head was what made it strange, unnatural. I slowed down, staring at it in disbelief, wondering if it was just some twisted trick of the eyes. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. But then, I saw another one. A Doberman this time, with its body crumpled in the grass at the side of the road. No head. The same eerie sight. And another. And another. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, scattered across the road in such regularity that I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something was horribly wrong. From Chihuahuas to Rottweilers, from Dachshunds to Great Danes, their lifeless, headless bodies were spread out over the highway, like some kind of grotesque pattern. I tried to push the thought away, but I couldn't. The scene was too surreal, too horrifying. The longer I drove, the more I saw. It wasn't just a few dogs, it was hundreds. Literally hundreds of them, scattered along the freeway, their heads nowhere to be found. Some of the bodies had been there for a while, stiff and starting to decay. Others were fresh, their fur still shiny and new, as if they had just been dropped there moments ago. I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was something deeply unsettling about the sight of those dogs, something that didn't just feel wrong but unnatural. How could there be so many of them? And why were their heads missing? I tried to keep my focus on the road, but I couldn't ignore the gruesome sight in my peripheral vision. It felt like I was driving through some twisted nightmare, one that kept getting worse the longer I stayed in it. The images kept flashing in front of me, decapitated dog after decapitated dog, each one more horrific than the last. At some point, I realized my friend wasn't just delusional. He had been seeing the same thing, and that realization made the whole situation even worse. It wasn't a trick of the mind. We had both seen the same thing, with no explanation for it. How could this be happening? Was there something out there, something human, behind all this? Someone doing this to these innocent animals? It didn't make sense, and it made my skin crawl. For what felt like forever, I drove. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening around me. But after about 60 miles of seeing the same horrifying scene, I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The weight of it all was too much. I couldn't just keep driving. I had to stop. I pulled off at the next exit, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I drove into a rest area, surrounded by other cars and trucks that had stopped for a break. I parked quickly and, without a second thought, ran to the bathroom. I couldn't even make it inside. I just leaned against the wall, throwing up into the nearest trash can. I remember feeling dizzy, like the world had tilted sideways. I could barely catch my breath, my chest tight with panic. It took me a few minutes to regain my composure, and even then, the images of the headless dogs wouldn't leave me. I washed my face with cold water, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My hands were still shaking. I didn't even want to think about what I had just witnessed. But I had to. I had to process it. I couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of fresh air, hoping to clear the fog in my mind. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was calming, but it couldn't drown out the horrors I had just seen. I walked back to the car slowly, my legs feeling weak. Ellie, our dog, was sleeping soundly in the back seat, completely unaware of what had just happened. I was thankful for that, but a part of me wondered if she had seen something I hadn't. I didn't talk much after that. Neither did my friend. We drove on in silence, our minds haunted by the images of those poor dogs. The rest of the drive was a blur. It felt like we were in some kind of suspended reality, like the world outside the car was a place we couldn't escape. I don't know what happened out there on that stretch of highway. I don't know who, or what, was responsible for those decapitated dogs. All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. The idea that someone, or something, could do something so horrific and leave such a trail of destruction behind, without anyone ever knowing, is something I'll never be able to understand. The next day, we continued our journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching on ahead, like nothing had ever happened. I don't talk about what happened that day. I don't think I ever will. It's not something I can explain, and it's not something I want to think about again. But every now and then, when I drive down a lonely stretch of road, I can't help but glance nervously at the shoulder. And I wonder, what was really going on out there? What did we really see? It was late on a cool summer evening when my girlfriend and I decided to visit the Obed National Wild and Scenic River in Wartburg, Tennessee. It was meant to be a quiet getaway, a peaceful trip to explore nature, far away from the city noise. Wartburg, a small town that barely made it on the map, didn't have much to offer, except for the river and the serenity that came with it. The only hotel in town wasn't exactly a five-star establishment. Its exterior was run down, with old mattresses scattered outside as if forgotten relics of better times. But we weren't there for the hotel. We were there to experience the river, and we were excited about it. We had spent the day hiking around and taking in the scenery, and now it was time to head back. The night had settled in, and the rain had started to fall lightly, creating a soft, rhythmic sound against the roof of the car. We were on a back road, one of those narrow, winding highways that stretch out endlessly through forests, with barely a house in sight. It was the kind of road where the only light came from the headlights of our car, casting long, thin beams into the thick trees that lined the roadside. At around 2 a.m., we had been driving for what felt like forever. The rain was still falling, and the road was slick with moisture. There was no one else in sight. We hadn't passed another vehicle in what seemed like an hour. We were completely alone. The atmosphere felt strange, isolating, and for some reason, I had the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. We came up on a curved bridge, the creek below it barely visible through the dark and the rain. As we rounded the corner and crossed the bridge, something strange caught my eye. There, sitting casually on the concrete guardrail, was a man. He was just sitting there, seemingly out of place, in the middle of nowhere, at this ungodly hour in the rain. He looked completely ordinary, maybe in his 20s, wearing a plaid shirt, his dark hair damp from the rain. There was nothing about him that screamed danger, but the sheer absurdity of the situation. No other cars for miles, pouring rain, and then this guy sitting on the bridge made my stomach tighten. We both saw him at the same time, and our reaction was instinctive. We both said, "What the hell?" as the car passed by. He didn't move, just sat there, staring at us as we went by. I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I didn't slow down. Neither of us said anything more. The weirdness of the situation made it hard to process, so we just continued driving. For the next 20 minutes, we drove in silence. The rain had let up a little, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs of civilization anywhere. The car's headlights barely illuminated the trees that lined the road. We weren't even sure where we were anymore. We had been following Google Maps, but the signal kept cutting in and out, leaving us unsure of our exact location. It felt like we were lost, driving through a patchwork of back roads with no clear direction. Then, Google Maps instructed us to take a right at an intersection. The road was dark, and the only option was straight or right, so I followed the direction. I instantly regretted it. The road went from asphalt to gravel to dirt almost immediately, and the path ahead became more and more treacherous. The trees crowded the sides of the road, and in places, the road seemed to disappear into a field, barely visible tire tracks marking where others had driven before. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. I was driving a small Honda, and I kept worrying that if we stopped for any reason, say a deer, I would get stuck in the mud. I wasn't used to driving on these kinds of roads, and the uncertainty of what was ahead started to make my heart race. We drove for about 10 minutes, the road getting worse with every passing second. Then, the inevitable happened. The road dead-ended in thick brush and a massive fallen tree. It was clear no one had come through here for years. Not a soul had driven this way. I cursed under my breath. There was no way to turn around here, but I had no choice but to back up and try to get back to the main road. The gravel was slick with rain, and I had long since turned off the traction control because I knew it would only make things worse. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly started to back the car uphill. The wheels spun for what felt like forever, though it was probably only 5 or 10 seconds. Finally, they caught, and we made our way back to the original road. I turned off Google Maps, fed up with it, and we started heading back. But here's where things took a terrifying turn. Just as I was about to get back to the gravel road, something blocked our path. A medium-sized tree had fallen directly in front of us. The strangest part, the tree wasn't there when we passed earlier. It hadn't fallen during the rainstorm. No, this tree had been dragged into place, creating an impassable barrier. The way it lay across the road didn't make sense. I could see the tire ruts in the dirt where it had been dragged, almost like someone had intentionally placed it there to block us. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. Who could have done this? How had they seen us? Why would anyone want to trap us out here? The woods around us were thick, and there was no one in sight. I could feel my pulse quicken. We were miles from anywhere, and the idea of being stuck out here, with no cell service and no way to communicate, sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed the spotlight from the back seat, my hands trembling. I got out of the car and shined the light into the woods, scanning the trees. Nothing. I walked around the car and shone the light up the road, but there was still nothing. My mind kept racing. Was there someone out there? Had someone seen us? Had we just walked into something we shouldn't have? I rushed back to the car, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and quickly dragged the tree out of the way. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, but when I glanced around, the woods were silent, save for the sound of rain dripping from the trees. I jumped back into the car, slammed the door, and quickly drove up the road, back onto the main highway. We finally made it to the shitty hotel in Wartburg, where we collapsed into bed, exhausted and shaken. But the images of that road, the dragged tree, and the sense that something wasn't right lingered in my mind long after we arrived. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the locals were playing a prank, seeing a couple of lost outsiders and having a bit of fun. Or maybe there were hunters in the woods who decided to mess with us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had wandered into something far darker. The whole experience left me feeling uneasy, like we had narrowly escaped something much worse than a prank. Later, I told my girlfriend about the tree and how it had been dragged into place. She looked at me in disbelief, but after everything we had gone through that night, I could tell she felt the same unease I did. She said, "I'm just glad we're out of there." I didn't know what to think anymore, but one thing was for sure. We were lucky to make it out of that place. Whatever had happened, I'll never forget the feeling of driving through that dark, rain-soaked road, and the eerie thought that we weren't as alone as we thought we were. It was late October when my boyfriend and I decided to go on a camping trip in a remote part of Canada. We had been looking for an escape from the hustle and bustle of our daily lives, and the thought of getting away from everything in the wilderness seemed like the perfect plan. We had set up camp in a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and the only sounds were the rustling of the trees in the wind and the occasional bird call. The weather was far from ideal. It had been raining on and off since we arrived, and the temperature had dropped significantly, making the air feel colder than it should have for this time of year. The persistent drizzle made everything damp and uncomfortable, but we were determined to make the most of it. We decided to take a hike up a steep trail to a lookout point, hoping the physical activity would warm us up. The trail was challenging, winding through dense forest, and we were the only ones on it. There were no other cars at the trailhead, and we hadn't seen anyone else camping or hiking in the area, which made it feel even more isolated. As we ascended, the trees around us grew thicker, and the misty rain combined with the cool air created an eerie atmosphere. Every step we took was met with the sound of crunching leaves beneath our boots, and the occasional drip of water falling from the trees. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the lookout point. The view was breathtaking, with the forest stretching out for miles, but the weather made it hard to truly enjoy it. The clouds were low and dark, the rain continued to fall, and the chill in the air cut through our clothes. We didn't stay long before deciding to head back down the trail. We started our descent, and by this time, the temperature had dropped even more. The rain had become steadier, and we were getting soaked. I was trying to focus on the path ahead, watching my step carefully to avoid slipping, but something made me look behind me. At first, I didn't believe my eyes. There, walking a few steps behind us, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She was alone, walking in the rain, wearing nothing but a t-shirt and what looked like a pair of shorts. The cold was unbearable, and the rain was coming down harder now, so I couldn't fathom why a child would be out here by herself, especially dressed so lightly for the weather. I stopped in my tracks, glancing over at my boyfriend. He hadn't noticed her yet, so I quietly pointed behind us. His eyes widened when he saw her. She was walking so casually, her small figure barely visible through the mist of the rain, and what struck me most was that she didn't seem to notice us at all. She wasn't asking for help or looking confused. She was just walking along, humming to herself, completely unfazed by the cold or the downpour. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the unease building in my chest. I kept stealing glances behind me, half expecting the girl to disappear, but each time I looked, she was still there, a few paces behind us. She wasn't walking in a straight line. At times, she would stop, twirl around, and then start skipping, all the while humming softly. It was almost as if she was in her own world, completely oblivious to the harsh weather around her, the slippery ground, and the fact that she was alone in the middle of nowhere. We tried not to let the situation freak us out. Maybe she had gotten separated from her parents. Maybe she was with a group further up the trail. But the more I thought about it, the less plausible that seemed. We had been hiking for a couple of hours, and there was no one else around. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. We continued walking down the trail, and with each glance over my shoulder, the girl seemed to be getting closer. It wasn't that she was speeding up, it was more like she was just matching our pace. But then something happened. I looked back one more time, and she was gone, completely vanished. There was no sign of her anywhere on the trail behind us. No footsteps in the mud, no sign of her t-shirt or bare legs in the rain. She had simply disappeared. My heart was racing now, and my boyfriend and I exchanged a look of confusion and anxiety. Where had she gone? How had she disappeared so quickly? We stopped walking for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. The girl had been there, and now she was gone. It didn't make any sense. We continued down the trail in silence, neither of us sure of what to say. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the little girl behind us again, but there was nothing. The forest seemed unnervingly quiet now, the usual sounds of wildlife and rain almost muted. Every step we took felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time we made it back to our campsite, we were both on edge. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail the entire time, and the rain had only gotten heavier as we walked. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. What was she doing out there alone? How had she been so unaffected by the cold? And where had she gone? It didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We sat in the tent, huddling together for warmth, and I found myself replaying the moment over and over in my head. We should have stopped and asked her if she was okay. We should have called out to her. But in that moment, I had been too stunned to act. I regretted it now, but it was too late. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy silence. The rain continued to fall outside, and the wind howled through the trees. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the little girl, her pale face, and her hauntingly calm demeanor. It was as if she had come out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, leaving only an unsettling feeling in her wake. The next morning, we packed up camp and made our way back to the car. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air lingered. We tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it was hard to forget what had happened. We had been out in the middle of nowhere, with no other hikers or campers around, and then, out of the blue, there had been this child, lost in the woods in the most inappropriate clothing for the weather. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I've thought about it a lot since then. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. It wasn't like anything I've ever experienced before. Part of me wonders if I had imagined it, if it was some kind of trick of the mind from the cold and the isolation. But then I remember the way she had hummed to herself, the way she had skipped along behind us without a care in the world, and I can't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about the whole thing. I only wish now that I had spoken to her, that I had done something to make sure she was okay. I think about her often, and I can't help but wonder if she was really out there alone, or if something else was going on. Whatever it was, it's something I'll never forget. My dad always talks about the strange thing that happened to him one cold winter night when he was a teenager. It's one of those stories that stuck with him, like an itch he could never quite scratch. He grew up in a tiny rural village in central Ohio during the 1980s. Back then, the town was barely a speck on the map, and the roads outside of town were long, dark stretches that seemed to go on forever with nothing but cornfields and flat land on either side. It's a place where, if you drove out at night, the world would feel like it disappeared completely. The streets empty, the houses few and far between, and the only light from your headlights cutting through the thick, enveloping darkness. It was around 11 p.m. or so, one of those late nights after a marching band event, and my dad's mom, his mother, who I always called Grandma, was driving him home. They'd been out in the town, which was maybe a few miles away, and it was the kind of night that didn't feel unusual, not at first. The radio was quiet in the car, and the only sound was the low hum of the tires on the old asphalt. There was no moon that night, and the clouds overhead had blanketed the sky, leaving the world below feeling suffocatingly dark. The road they were driving down was a long, unlit stretch that cut through the countryside. On either side of them were wide, flat cornfields that seemed endless in the distance. It was winter, and the fields were barren, just bare, frozen ground with the occasional patch of dead, yellowed stalks sticking out from the earth. There weren't any houses or streetlights for miles. The only sign of life came from the occasional tree that had been stunted by the freezing cold. They were about halfway down the road when they saw her. My dad says it happened so suddenly that at first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There, walking along the edge of the ditch that ran parallel to the road, was a woman. She was barefoot, walking through the icy wet grass, with no shoes to protect her from the cold. She was wearing nothing but a thin, white nightgown. the kind you would expect to see someone wear when they're just waking up or getting ready for bed. The strangest part, she didn't seem to notice them at all. No sign of distress, no begging for help. She wasn't waving her arms or trying to flag them down. She was just walking, barefoot, through the ditch, her thin nightgown billowing slightly in the wind, walking slowly and deliberately in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you couldn't imagine anyone being out there at all, let alone in the dead of night with the freezing air biting at their skin. As they drove past, my dad and grandma both looked at her, almost in disbelief. The woman didn't look back at them. She didn't even seem to acknowledge their presence. She just kept walking, humming to herself as if she didn't have a care in the world. My dad remembers the strange sound of her humming cutting through the silence of the night, like a distant melody floating in the wind. He said it was the kind of thing that made you feel uneasy, like something wasn't quite right, but you couldn't put your finger on it. It wasn't until they had passed her that the feeling hit them both. Something was off about that woman. My dad said the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his stomach turned with unease. His grandma, normally so practical and down-to-earth, looked over at him with wide eyes. The woman's appearance, the way she was just walking there, out in the cold with no regard for her safety, set something off in both of them. Something didn't feel right. They both felt a strange compulsion to turn around, to make sure the woman wasn't in danger. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she had wandered away from her home or gotten lost. They couldn't ignore the pit in their stomachs that told them she was in trouble. She was so pale, almost unnaturally so, that it made her seem sickly, like she'd been bedridden for days or even weeks. The pallor of her skin was strikingly white, even under the dim glow of the car's headlights, and it looked almost translucent in the way that made it difficult to look at for too long. Without saying much, my dad's grandma made a decision. They needed to go back. They needed to check on her, make sure she was okay. It wasn't even a question. She wasn't the kind of woman to ignore someone in need, and the feeling that something wasn't right gnawed at them both as they turned the car around, driving back down the dark road. They didn't talk much during that drive, the silence hanging heavy between them as the car's headlights pierced the thick darkness. They could both feel the cold creeping in, pressing against the windows, as the rain began to fall lightly, the sound of it pattering against the roof and windshield. When they reached the spot where they had seen the woman, they slowed down, scanning the side of the road. The car's headlights swept over the grass, the frozen earth, the ditch that she had been walking along, but there was nothing there. No woman, no sign of her at all. They drove past the area a few more times, making sure they didn't miss anything. They pulled over at one point and got out, walking along the ditch in the freezing cold rain, calling out into the night for the woman. But there was no answer, no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The ditch was shallow, no more than 4 feet deep in some places, but the terrain was flat and barren. If she had run into the fields, they would have seen her. There were no buildings nearby, no trees that could have obscured her, no place for her to hide. The fields stretched out for miles, unbroken and empty. There was nowhere she could have gone that quickly. My dad and grandma eventually gave up. The fear in their stomachs was replaced by confusion, and then a lingering sense of dread. They didn't understand what had happened. Where had the woman gone? Had she run off? Had she disappeared into the night, somehow evading them? Or had they encountered something else? Even now, years later, my dad still talks about that night as if it was something he can't quite explain, something that haunts him. He feels certain they saw a ghost, a figure that had somehow appeared out of nowhere, walking in the cold night, barefoot and pale. A woman who seemed too out of place, too strange to be real. My grandma, though, has always been practical, and she refuses to believe in ghosts. She suggested, more than once, that the woman might have been a sleepwalker, someone who had wandered out of their home, startled by the headlights of the car, and hidden when they drove by. But my dad still isn't convinced. To him, the whole experience feels like a warning, like something that never quite made sense, but stuck with him like a memory he couldn't shake. He still wonders what happened to that woman, whether she was real or just a figment of his imagination, or maybe something worse. What haunts him, even more than the encounter itself, is the question he can never answer. What if they had stopped? What if they had tried to help her? Would it have made a difference? Would they have been able to save her? Or would they have been caught in something far darker than they ever imagined? It was a cold, rainy night in the middle of October. I was on my way home from a work trip, driving down a long stretch of highway, and the road was completely empty. There weren't any other cars, no streetlights, just the dull glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had been on the road for hours, and the drive had started to feel endless. I was exhausted, and the only thing I wanted to do was get home and go to bed. I turned on the radio, but the static mixed with the rain tapping against my windshield made it hard to focus on anything. The only sounds I could hear were the hum of my tires on the wet road and the constant downpour. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to push through the fatigue, knowing I had a few more hours before I could reach home. That's when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal to see a car behind you when you're driving on a highway. But as the car started gaining on me, I began to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't the normal pattern of a car trying to pass me. This car stayed right behind me, even when I sped up. And I mean really sped up. I thought, maybe I'm just paranoid. It's late. Maybe I'm just tired. But the car stayed right behind me, just tailing me, never slowing down. I glanced at my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. This wasn't a regular car. It was black, but not like any normal black car I'd seen. The paint was matte, and it was sleek, almost unnaturally dark, like it was absorbing the light around it. I couldn't make out any details of the car's shape, but what bothered me the most was the lack of any visible markings or plates. The headlights were blinding, almost too bright, and they seemed to cut through the rain and mist as though they were focused directly on me. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't like I had ever had a car follow me like this. My instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. I tried to focus on the road ahead of me, but the car kept following, never changing its distance. It was too close for comfort. I had never been the type of person to panic easily, but at that moment, I felt my heart start racing. My palms started sweating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to test it. I started speeding up, trying to shake off whatever this car was. I pushed the pedal harder, but the black car stayed right there, just behind me. It didn't matter how fast I went. This car was keeping up. It was like it was waiting for me to make a move. I glanced over at the side of the road. There was nothing around, just miles and miles of empty highway and dark woods. I was alone, and the rain kept coming down, heavy and relentless. The more I tried to speed up, the more the car seemed to cling to me. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator again, this time going even faster. The car behind me followed suit, still maintaining its position. By now, I was sure it wasn't just a coincidence. I had tried everything, and still, the black car was there, right behind me. I started to feel trapped. I didn't want to pull over, but I had no choice. The next exit was coming up, and I decided to take it. I veered off the highway and onto a smaller road, hoping to lose the black car. As I took the turn, I glanced back at the rearview mirror, but the car was still there, still right behind me. My heart skipped a beat. How could it be following me so perfectly? There was no way it was this persistent for just a coincidence. I pulled off the road into a small gas station parking lot. I parked my car and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and maybe I had overreacted. I glanced into the rearview mirror again, and that's when I realized the black car was gone. It was like it vanished. No car in sight, no headlights shining, nothing. I stared out the window into the night, confused. I didn't understand how it had happened. The parking lot wasn't big, and there was no way the car could have passed without me seeing it. I looked around, but there was no sign of it. I felt like I was in some kind of dream. What had just happened? Was it my imagination? Was I just seeing things? I sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do. I could feel my pulse still racing. It didn't make any sense. After a few minutes, I decided to get out of the car and check. Maybe I could see something, anything, that would explain it. But when I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight. I walked around the gas station, keeping an eye on the dark highway, but there was nothing. The place was deserted, the only sounds being the distant hum of the wind and the soft patter of rain against the pavement. The black car didn't reappear. I was still trying to wrap my head around what had happened when I finally decided to leave. I didn't want to stay there longer than I had to. I climbed back into my car, started the engine, and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I drove for another few miles, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the black car again. But there was nothing. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and quiet, and I eventually made it back to the main highway. As I continued on my drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind kept replaying the events, and I kept asking myself if I had imagined it. The car, where had it gone? Why had it followed me like that? It didn't make any sense. By the time I got home, the feeling had started to fade, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The black car, the headlights, the way it just disappeared. I had never been so unsettled by something so simple before. To this day, I still think about that night. I can't explain what happened, and I don't want to. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I'll never forget the sensation of being followed down that empty, rainy highway by a car that shouldn't have been there. Something about it didn't feel right, and it still haunts me every time I drive alone at night. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where everything seems to slow down and the world feels far away. The kind of night where you could almost convince yourself you were the only person left in the world. The road stretched ahead of me, the headlights illuminating the wet asphalt, and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the road was almost hypnotic. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it home after a long day, and I was more than ready to be out of the car and in the comfort of my own bed. The rain had been coming down steadily since I hit the highway. It wasn't too heavy, just enough to make the world outside seem hazy, a blurry landscape of dark trees and fields. The road was mostly empty, with only the occasional passing car. I had been on this stretch of highway before, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just the tiredness from the long drive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I was alone, the car was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine, and the rain tapping against the windshield. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, just past 11 p.m. The only thing I wanted was to get home, but the road seemed endless, stretching out in front of me with no end in sight. It was about then that I noticed something odd in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person standing in the ditch by the side of the road. A woman, barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately felt uneasy. Now, you have to understand, this was a very rural part of the highway. There weren't any towns or houses for miles. The only thing around were vast fields and the occasional tree. It was well past midnight, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The rain was cold, and yet there she was, barefoot, in a nightgown, standing motionless in the ditch. I slowed down as I approached her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the rain, her head slightly tilted down. As I drove past, I couldn't help but look at her out of the corner of my eye. Her skin was pale, too pale, almost unnaturally so, and her hair was wet and sticking to her face. She didn't seem to acknowledge my car at all, just standing there, as if she didn't even notice it. I couldn't stop staring, but there was something strange about the whole situation. Something about the way she was standing there, so still, so quiet, felt wrong. I tried to push the feeling aside, thinking maybe she was just someone stranded, waiting for help. But who would be out there, alone at this hour in the rain, with no car and no flashlight? It didn't make sense. I continued driving, my mind racing, but I couldn't shake the image of her from my head. She hadn't even moved when I passed. She hadn't called out for help, hadn't looked up at me as if she needed assistance. She had just stood there, in the dark, in the rain, looking almost lifeless. As I drove further down the road, I started to think that maybe I should turn around and check on her. Something didn't sit right with me. What if she was in trouble? What if she was sick or lost? I couldn't just leave her out there in the middle of nowhere. I made a U-turn and started driving back down the road. The rain was coming down harder now, and the road was slick. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the ditches on either side, but there was no sign of her. I kept my eyes on the sides of the road as I drove, my heart racing. Where could she have gone? I reached the spot where I had seen her standing, but there was no one there. The ditch was empty, and the rain kept falling, making everything look even more desolate. I drove a little further down the road, thinking maybe I had missed her, but there was nothing. No sign of her at all. I pulled over to the side of the road, feeling more confused than ever. I sat there for a moment, just staring out into the rain. Maybe she had just wandered off, I thought. Maybe she had been waiting for someone to pick her up, or maybe she had just gotten lost. but something about it all still didn't feel right. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had been standing there, so still, without moving, without saying a word. I checked the clock on the dashboard again, just past midnight. I was exhausted, and I had been driving for hours. I thought about getting back on the road, but the feeling of unease was still there, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the image of her pale face, and the way she hadn't seemed to care about the car passing by. I took a deep breath and turned the car back on. I didn't want to sit out there in the rain any longer. I needed to get home. But as I started to drive again, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I had to know what had happened to her. It didn't make sense. I decided to take a different route, one that would take me through a small town up ahead. Maybe someone there had seen her, or maybe she had gone into one of the nearby houses. At this point, I just needed answers. My mind wouldn't let it go. I drove for a while, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The streets were empty, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. I passed a few houses, but there was no sign of life anywhere. The town was quiet, too quiet, as if everyone was hiding from the storm. I decided to pull over in front of a small convenience store, hoping to find someone who could tell me if they knew anything about the woman I had seen. I got out of the car and walked up to the door, but it was locked. I knocked, but no one answered. I tried calling the number on the window, but the phone just rang and rang. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold rain soak through my jacket. It was as if the whole town had gone silent, as if no one wanted to acknowledge what I had just seen. I couldn't explain it, but the eerie feeling was growing stronger with every passing second. I turned around and got back into the car. I drove back to the highway, trying to push the whole experience out of my mind. The woman in the ditch, the strange emptiness of the town, it all felt wrong. But I couldn't figure out what it was. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that I would never understand. As I continued down the highway, the rain began to slow, and the night grew quieter. The world seemed to settle, but I couldn't let go of the memory of that woman standing in the ditch. I don't know who she was or where she went, but I'll never forget the feeling that something wasn't right about that night. I still think about it sometimes when I drive down lonely roads at night. Maybe she was just someone lost and in need of help. Maybe she was a sleepwalker or someone with a strange story of their own. But I still can't shake the thought that there was something else going on that night. Something I'll never understand. And every time I drive down a long, empty stretch of road, I wonder if I'll ever see her again. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, with only the soft glow of my headlights cutting through the heavy rain. The weather had been bad all day. It had rained off and on, and now it was almost a steady downpour, soaking everything in its path. I had been driving for hours, heading back home from a visit to a friend's house. The drive was long, especially in this rural part of the country, and I had hoped the rain would let up, but it didn't. It just kept falling, making everything look blurred, like the world was hidden behind a watery veil. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 11 p.m. I had a few more miles to go before I reached the main road that would take me home, but the loneliness of the highway was starting to get to me. The road was empty, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel isolated, like you're the only person left on Earth. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just fields and trees on either side. The only sound was the steady hum of my tires on the wet asphalt. As I drove, I started to notice how quiet everything seemed. The only movement was the rain, tapping softly on the roof of the car. The headlights lit up patches of the road, but most of the landscape beyond them was just dark and unknown. I wasn't really scared, but the isolation was unsettling. In the back of my mind, I kept telling myself to stay alert, that the road was long and the night was still young. About half an hour passed before I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the rain, some strange shadow or blur caused by the headlights reflecting off the wet road. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing in the ditch by the side of the road. A woman. Now, in a place like this, where there's nothing but flat farmland for miles, seeing someone standing alone by the side of the road in the middle of the night didn't make sense. There weren't any towns nearby, not for miles. There were no houses, no businesses. Just the open road and fields on either side. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. She was barefoot. Her feet were covered in mud, and she wasn't wearing a coat or anything warm. She was wearing only a thin nightgown, drenched from the rain. The nightgown clung to her body, and I could see how pale she was, her skin almost white under the harsh light of my headlights. She didn't look up at me as I passed, just kept walking along the edge of the ditch, her head lowered slightly. I felt a chill run through me as I passed. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here, alone, in the middle of the night, barefoot, wearing nothing but a nightgown? And why was she walking along the side of the road, in the rain, without even a flashlight or a coat? My mind started racing, trying to come up with an explanation. As I glanced at her through the window, I noticed how still she was. She didn't seem to notice the car or the headlights, like she was in a world of her own. There was no sense of urgency in her movements, no sign that she was lost or scared. It was as though she was simply walking, without any real direction or purpose. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was just someone who had gotten lost or was stranded, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I drove a little further down the road, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. But I couldn't get her out of my head. There was something about the way she just stood there, so still and quiet, that felt off. I looked in my rearview mirror, but the woman was no longer in sight. I couldn't tell if she had stopped or if I had just passed her without realizing it. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had to turn around. Something was nagging at me, telling me I needed to check on her. What if she was lost? What if she was in danger? I couldn't just leave her out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere, especially in this weather. I made a decision. I took the next turn and looped back around, heading back to where I had seen her. My heart was racing a little now, the feeling of unease growing stronger with every passing second. What if she wasn't just some lost traveler? What if there was something more to this? My mind kept running through different scenarios, trying to figure out what I had seen. As I drove back down the road, I could feel the tension building. The rain was coming down harder now, and the road was slick. The wipers swished back and forth, clearing the rain from the windshield, but it felt like they weren't doing enough to clear the heaviness in the air. I reached the spot where I had seen her standing in the ditch, but there was no sign of her. I slowed down, my headlights scanning the area, looking for any sign of movement, but the ditch was empty. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. Where had she gone? There was no way she could have disappeared that quickly. I drove a little further, hoping I had just missed her, but there was nothing. No sign of her anywhere. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to gather my thoughts. What was going on? Could she have walked into the fields? But the land around here was flat and barren, especially this time of year. The fields were empty, and there were no trees or obstacles for her to hide behind. I sat there for a few minutes, just staring at the road. It didn't make sense. How could she have just disappeared like that? I decided to get out of the car and walk back to the spot where I had seen her. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I could find some trace of her. But when I got out of the car and walked toward the ditch, there was nothing. Not even a footprint in the wet ground. I looked around, scanning the area, but all I could see were empty fields stretching out in the distance. There were no houses, no lights, no signs of life anywhere. I even walked a little further down the road, thinking maybe she had walked off in the rain, but still there was nothing. The rain was pouring down harder now, soaking my clothes and making everything slippery, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. I returned to the car, my mind spinning. Where had she gone? Who was she? And why had she been out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere? The whole situation felt wrong, and the feeling of unease that had started when I first saw her was now a full-blown panic in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but something told me I had just experienced something I couldn't explain. I sat in the car for a while, not knowing what to do. The rain continued to fall, the only sound in the darkness. I had no idea where she had gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to see her, that something important had just happened. Eventually, I decided to continue my drive. I needed to get home, and there was nothing else I could do. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Her pale skin, her nightgown, the way she didn't even acknowledge the car passing by. The whole thing felt like it was meant to be unsettling, like I wasn't supposed to understand what had just happened. To this day, I still think about it sometimes. Who was she? What happened to her? Was she just a lost traveler, or was there something more to the story? I may never know, but I can't help but wonder, every time I drive alone down a long, empty road, if I'll ever encounter her again. If I'll see that pale face in the rain, walking quietly along the side of the road, the woman in the ditch. I don't think I'll ever forget her. It was the kind of night that made you feel like the world was moving in slow motion, like time was stretching out and you were the only one moving through it. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, the sound of it pattering against the roof of the car as I drove down a long, desolate stretch of highway. I wasn't in a hurry. I was just trying to get home after a long day, my mind somewhere between the past and the future, absorbed in the quiet hum of the car. I glanced at the clock, almost 11:30 p.m. It felt later than that, though. The road ahead was nothing but a dark ribbon of asphalt stretching out into the unknown, and I had no idea how many miles I had left to go. There were no signs of civilization, not a single light in sight. No houses, no streetlights, no other cars. Just endless fields on either side, their shapes barely visible in the dark, the rain falling in sheets. The headlights of my car barely made a dent in the inky blackness that surrounded me. I was used to driving on these roads, rural, isolated, the kind of place where everything felt far removed from the rest of the world. But tonight, for some reason, it felt even quieter than usual. The air was thick with the sound of the rain, the world muted, like it was holding its breath. I had been driving for a while now, and I was starting to get a little uncomfortable. The emptiness was starting to get to me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the late hour and the rain playing tricks on me. But the more I drove, the more I felt that sense of unease settling in, like I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone out here. That's when I saw her. At first, it didn't register. I was too busy focusing on the road ahead, trying to keep my attention sharp in the dark and the rain. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was too far ahead to make out clearly, but there was definitely something, or someone standing there. At first, I thought it might be another car, but there were no headlights, no indication of any other vehicles around. Just that dark shape standing at the edge of the ditch. I slowed down instinctively, my heart picking up speed as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman was standing in the ditch parallel to the road, her figure almost swallowed up by the darkness. She was barefoot, which struck me as odd, especially considering the cold weather. The rain was pouring down, and the temperature was well below freezing. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, barefoot, in the dead of night? I could see her more clearly as I got closer. She was wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, soaked through by the rain. Her pale skin was almost glowing in the dim light from my headlights. She didn't look up at the car as I approached, didn't wave or move in any way that seemed human. She was just walking slowly, like she didn't even notice I was there, like she was in her own world, unaware of the car driving past. I felt a chill run down my spine as I passed her. I couldn't stop myself from looking in the rearview mirror, my mind racing. Was she lost? How had she ended up here, so far from any place where she could find help? There were no houses nearby, no lights, nothing but the dark, open fields stretching out in every direction. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just someone out for a walk, maybe she was a local. But it didn't make sense. Who would walk along the side of a dark road at this time of night, in the middle of a downpour, wearing nothing but a nightgown? I felt the unease creeping up again, a feeling deep in my gut that told me something was wrong. I looked behind me, just to see if she had stopped or moved out of sight. But when I checked the rearview mirror, she was still there, just walking along the edge of the ditch, her head bent down, her steps slow and measured. She didn't seem to notice the car behind her. It was like she was in a trance, moving forward, step by step, without a care in the world. As I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mind kept circling back to her. What if she was lost? What if she needed help? The thought nagged at me. I couldn't just leave her out there, not knowing who she was or what had brought her to that spot. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that she was fine, that she was probably just some local who lived nearby. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I made a decision. I had to turn around and check on her. It didn't matter if I was late or if I was just being paranoid. I couldn't leave her out there alone in the rain, especially in such dangerous conditions. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I had to at least try to help. I turned the car around, the tires slipping a little on the wet road. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself that everything would be fine, that it was just a simple misunderstanding, that she was just a local out for a walk, and that I was being overdramatic. But the closer I got to where I had seen her, the more my anxiety grew. I slowed down as I approached the spot where she had been walking, but she wasn't there anymore. I looked around, scanning the area with my headlights, but there was no sign of her. No trace of her nightgown, No footprints in the wet ditch. Just the rain and the dark, empty road. I couldn't believe it. Where had she gone? How could she have disappeared so quickly? I drove a little further down the road, hoping I had just missed her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. What had just happened? There was no way she could have just vanished into thin air. I decided to get out of the car, to walk along the ditch, and see if I could find any sign of her. But the rain was coming down harder now, and the cold was biting into my skin as I stepped out into the night. I walked up and down the road, searching the ditch, the fields, looking for any sign of where she had gone. But there was nothing. The fields were flat and barren, and the area around the ditch was open, with no place for someone to hide. I walked for what felt like an eternity, but I found nothing. No sign of footprints, no signs of movement. It was like she had just disappeared. I returned to the car, my heart heavy with confusion. I didn't know what to think. What had I just seen? Had I imagined it? Had she somehow run off and hidden somewhere? Or was there something more to it? I couldn't understand what had happened, but something told me I wasn't going to get any answers that night. I got back in the car and drove away, the rain still pouring down, the sound of it almost deafening. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there, still walking along the edge of the road. But there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching on into the darkness. To this day, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was she? Where did she go? What was she doing out there, alone, in the middle of the night? I'll never know. But I can't help but feel like something strange happened that night. Something I'll never fully understand. The woman in the ditch. She'll always be with me, a mystery that never quite goes away.